Understanding Colorado's fiscal policies can seem like a daunting task, and with each amendment passed over the last 30 years, figuring out the best way forward can seem close to impossible. In this video, we'll try and unpack these twists and turns so that each of us can make better decisions about Colorado's future. Let's look at this issue through the lens of education. In the 1980s, Colorado spent roughly $500 more than the national average on funding per student. By 2000, Colorado was spending roughly $1,000 per student less than the national average. Today, we spend close to $2,800 less than the national average. That currently ranks us 42nd in the country for per pupil spending. How did this happen? Let's first unpack how Colorado funds education. The primary sources include local property tax, state sales and income tax, and federal funds from Washington. The local property tax side of things is just that. Money coming in from property taxes collected within the school's county, based on a set equation of assessment rates and a percentage of a home's value, called mills. And the state backfills the remainder of funding needed with sales and income taxes. This balance worked for a while, and we kept up with the national average of education spending. However, in 1982, Colorado passed the Gallagher Amendment, which regulates the property tax revenue a local government brings in, stipulating that of all the property tax revenue coming in across our state, 45% must be from residential and 55% must be from business. It also required assessment rates for the entire state, with business property taxes locked in at 29%. This leaves just the residential rate to fluctuate as the property market goes up and down. For the time being, this was easily handled by our elected lawmakers, who had the power to raise or lower assessment rates, and local governments could set mill levies accordingly to keep funding stable. Then, in 1992, Colorado passed Tabor, which had a ripple effect across our state. One thing it did was take away elected lawmakers' ability to set tax policy. This had a big effect on Gallagher. The requirement that all tax rate increases needed to be voted on at the ballot meant that the state could still lower tax rates when needed, but was less likely to raise residential assessment rates. Over the years, some rate hikes have been successful, others have not. The result? A property tax system frozen in time and less money coming in from local governments for schools, which meant a larger portion of the state budget had to go towards backfilling local school budgets, while also balancing other spending priorities like transportation and healthcare. Even as schools started to see less funding, the state's stretched general fund began to bump up against another provision of Tabor, the revenue cap. This section of Tabor requires the state to return any revenue to the taxpayers that exceeds a constitutionally determined amount. Instead of giving temporary refunds, however, the 1999 legislature decided to pass permanent tax cuts, lowering our income tax from 5% to 4.63%. The tax cuts did decrease revenue below the Tabor cap, but unfortunately just 2 years later, a recession meant the Colorado economy struggled and the government began to pull back funding for critical services. Now, two sections of Tabor became very real challenges. Coloradans formed a broad coalition to pass Referendum C, which gave the state a 5-year timeout from the Tabor cap, resetting the cap to the highest point of growth during the timeout. After the 5-year period, the cap still only grew based on inflation and population growth. But when you look at where we could have been if we didn't pass Referendum C, things could be a lot worse. But we're not out of the woods yet. So if our goal is to raise education funding back to at least the national average, why don't we just prioritize education funding? We tried that. In 2000, the voters passed Amendment 23, which required funding to increase with the rate of inflation. Seems simple enough. But when the going got tough, like in the Great Recession, our limited revenue combined with Amendment 23's mandated education funding meant there was extreme pressure on other investments like transportation and health. In the end, we reneged on that promise, and lawmakers created what's called the negative factor, which essentially keeps a tally of how much money we should be putting into education, like an IOU. This means that on top of having less revenue to go around, we now have to eventually put part of that revenue towards our debt to Amendment 23. That's basically how we got here. This is why our schools are underfunded, our transportation system left to be desired, and why there are so many other cracks left unfilled. So how do we finally solve this puzzle? Do we get rid of Tabor entirely and just remove its effects completely? Our Supreme Court just said that legally we could do this. Do we simply get rid of the revenue cap so that our state can grow with the economy? There's a measure that the legislature has referred called Proposition CC that we'll be voting on in November. Is it time to make changes to Gallagher and enable local governments to better fund schools? Many ideas are being thrown around, including different property tax assessment rates for different regions. Is it time to look at our tax code and modernize it? The entire country is talking about how it's time for the wealthy to pay higher taxes. Colorado could do this if we make changes to the Tabor provision that prohibits a graduated tax code. While we can all debate which path is best, it's clear that this is our problem, our cube to solve. And knowing the facts about why we are where we are is the first step in making sure Colorado can lead the way to a better future. To learn more, visit us at bellpolicy.org.